Hi everybody, you're all very welcome to the first of our Digital Cultures series of talks that's being co-organised by NCAD Dublin and by the Digital Hub and curated by myself, Rachel O'Dwyer, and artist in residence in the Digital Hub, Elaine Hoey. So our event today, Translating Nature, is the first of a whole series of events that we're going to be doing twice monthly from now up until mid-June, that's dealing with various different aspects of digital culture and art and technology. So I just wanted to jump in and introduce our theme today of Translating Natures and introduce the speakers we have. So we've had kind of a really interesting range of speakers, I think, with us today. So artists who are doing very, very interesting work with data, and also researchers who are exploring, aspects of citizen science as it relates to environmental governance. So I'm going to just jump in, I guess, and give a little overview of our three speakers. So our theme today is Translating Nature. So we're looking at, as I said, various different artists or researchers who are translating data from living systems into visual representations, photographic exhibitions, sound compositions, and so on. And we want to explore maybe some of the interfaces then between technology, citizen science, and artistic practices. Find what sorts of ways of knowing maybe those sorts of practices are bringing to light, and asking maybe how can these be used in future discussions or environmental debates. So our three speakers today are Patrick Bresnahan, Julie Freeman, and Fiona McDonald. And I'm just going to begin by introducing Dr. Patrick Bresnahan. He's a lecturer in the Department of Geography at Maynooth University, working across the interdisciplinary fields of urban political ecology, science and technology studies, and environmental humanities. And part of the reason we invited Patrick today is that his practice is often quite collaborative, so including working with environmental scientists, working with activist groups, and working with artists. His research explores the intersections of technological infrastructures and natural ecologies, with a particular focus on water contamination, industrial agriculture, rural climate justice, citizen science, and the politics of things like energy and data infrastructures. Patrick is the author of a book, Transforming the Fisheries, Neoliberalism, Nature and the Commons, which is published at the University of Nebraska Press. And then we have Dr. Julie Freeman joining us today as well. Julie's work explores relationships between science and nature, questioning the use of technology and how we translate our world. And she's often working with living systems. Her work transforms complex processes and data from real-time sources into kinetic sculptures, physical objects, images, sound compositions, and animations. And it's been exhibited very widely. She's also she's founded the Data as Culture art program in the Open Data Institute, and she's the co-founder of Fine Acts. Fiona McDonald then is a Dublin-based interdisciplinary artist who has a really interesting background in biological chemistry and then in fine art and multimedia systems. And she's currently artist in residence in innovation and technology at Talent Garden on DCU Alpha Campus. And Fiona is going to speak to us about a number of recent works that she's been doing, kind of that bring together these aspects of, things like biodiversity, climate change with her kind of visual and kind of multimedia art practice. So I think we're going to kick off with Julie's talk. We've pre-recorded these just kind of for a bit of extra security with Wi-Fi. So I think Julie is going to share her screen now and play her talk for us.
Hi, I'm Julie Freeman, and I'd like to talk today about the framing of data as an art material and why I think it's so important. Our world is data. We measure and quantify almost everything, and now we're more aware of data's impact in our lives. I feel that as artists, we must really critically interrogate it as we would any other material that we work with. And it's key that we fully comprehend the languages, the symbols, and the codes that we use when we are describing and deciphering data, and then therefore how we're describing the world around us. And as Aldous Huxley has written, when we invent new things, we invent a language to describe it. And data art and data visualization are parts of this new language. So my work is an exploration into the notion of data as an art material. And it has been for probably about 20 years, albeit in different guises. I have two main strands of inquiry. One is my personal art practice, which focuses on the translation of natural living systems using data. And my curatorial and production work with collaborators such as the Open Data Institute, which tends to take a broader approach to data in art and working with other artists. And I think there's an urgent need to expose the narratives around the understanding and use of data as a material. So here's a few examples from my own practice, translating nature, which has evolved over the years. I'm going to whiz through them because I want to give you my context and how my thinking has developed to where it is now, and why I am an advocate of data as an art material and not data as truth or data as evidence by default. So this is from 1997, and it's my first foray into artificial life programming, which I love, and data-informed sound composition. And the fish generated a soporific soundscape, which was my attempt at translating the visually hypnotic rhythm of fish into a form of music, into organised sound. And I used video analysis to track the fish and map the sounds to their location data. So this is kind of my first data artwork. Another work from around that time was the digital wave. Now this is a physical embodiment of data made with a company that I was a founder of, Studio Fish. And we created this in 1998. And the work grabbed your photo, processed it through a series of filters and projected it in an animated flow down the 15-meter long wave, which is a very organic form. And your face was algorithmically deconstructed and then represented as data patterns, which you could interact with, adding sort of pixel rain to the images as you walked alongside the flow. And these works weren't really described as data artworks 22 years ago, but that's exactly what they were. And fast forward a bit to 2005, and a Nesta Fellowship enabled the tank-based fish project I just showed to be scaled up into a work called The Lake. And this became a site-specific work which was positioned in its natural environment. And it was during the sort of 18-month production period for this work that I really had time to interrogate what I was doing within my own practice. So the idea of using digital technologies to connect with nature in new ways, but with data at the heart of the process. And even then, you know, I knew that my subjective decisions around the manipulation of data were equally as important to the work as the so-called objective data from the electronic bioacoustic tagging system. I decided the frequency of the data collection. I decided to give the fish a particular aesthetic. I decided on all the static parameters in the software framework, and then the data flowed in and to add like an unpredictable real-time dynamic. So there's a lot of me in this work, and I made a lot of choices of how I wanted it to be, and then the data kind of brought it to life. And for me, the time-based data is a really fascinating material. So it's one of the few art materials that can add this fourth dimension of time into your artwork. It reflects nature's constant flux and injects an essence of life into the work. And 15 years on, after The Lake, I'm still working with this particular type of data. And I explore multiple translations of the same time-based data in rat systems. This is a multi-part artwork, data visualization and a series of behavioral analysis, which formed the bulk of my PhD research. It's an animated data visualization, a more abstract animation and soundscape, and a series of small soft robotic kinetic sculptures. And all of these pieces of work are informed by the same data set from a colony of naked mole rats. And in this work, to accompany these, I used photography to provoke us to think about animal data privacy. And these portraits are about how we need to take care with non-human location metadata and how it is attached to the photos we share to prevent poaching of rare flora and fauna. So for instance, if you on safari and you take a picture of an elephant and it's got the location data tagged to it and you share it on a social media network, collectors and poachers actively scan for that information to find out where the animals are so that they can go and remove their tusks, or they can collect the rare orchid or whatever it might be. It's a real problem, and we really have to think about data privacy for non-human things, species, objects. So these 4 very different approaches to data, all within a sort of creative context, but just one colony of naked mole rats. And these different approaches to data can be seen in the works that form the Data as Culture art programme, which I founded at the Open Data Institute in 2012. And the programme enables and encourages artists to work critically, playfully and practically with data in many different ways. And we help artists to think about what types and forms of data they're using, with a taxonomy for describing data when it is used as an art material. And this is a step towards having a shared language to categorize, compare and critique works effectively. So here you can choose to have a look at work that only uses biological data, or only uses work that has got some anonymized data within it. And all of the works on that website are tagged with these different types. And along with this taxonomy, the backbone of my thesis was the subjective data flow. And you'll notice that it contains the word we an awful lot. How do we make the decisions when working with data? How many are based on assumption, restrictions of hardware, of time, of money, on anecdotes from colleagues, on gut feelings? I mean, we are not neutral in the way that we create our works, and nor is data. A data point, for example, can have various levels of complexity. My puppy, her weight in kilos is sort of universally understood and generally quite trusted. But a data point that indicates how quickly a coronavirus is spreading, the R value, for example, is a highly complex number based on various samples, assumptions, multiple prediction models, and a variety of statistical methods. I mean, I feed my dog based on the data that I collect and analyse about her. But the government, however, makes laws and builds temporary hospitals, which often remain empty, based on the data that it is collecting and analysing. So it's really essential that we acknowledge the subjective decision-making, the context, the human input into the processes, and take all of this into account before we act on data. And I'm particularly interested, as I mentioned, in the time series data as a way to add dynamism to my work. But this is just one form of data and one use of it. And it's important to note that in this field, or in fact in any field, any system that uses data, such as machine learning or AI projects, that we often use the word data to represent far too many things. But we can be clearer. We can say my work uses real-time, time-based environmental data. We can say, oh, it uses processed archival data, or it uses synthetic personal data adjusted for bias and anonymity. Describing your data helps your audience understand your work. A real-time data feed has an extra layer of excitement over an archived stream because it has the potential for the audience to experience something unpredictable. It adds a frisson to the work that is slightly different. And that's exciting for them as much as it is for you as the artist. And when it comes to working with living systems, this real-time element connects your audience to the here and now, and it shifts them closer to the subject. There's some sort of element of risk involved. In active living infrastructure controlled environment, or ALICE, it's a bit of a mouthful, we use real-time, time-based data from microbes, which are generating electricity in microbial fuel cells, to control rules in an artificial life-based animated environment. And not only are the microbes affecting the animation, they are powering the sensors that collects the data about them. So for this piece of work, the close to real-time nature of the work is essential. If the microbes equilibrium is disrupted, the sensors stop collecting the data and the animation will fail. So it's a very critical system. And we display the available energy and the other data points to help people understand this relationship. But it's not the role of the animation alone to tell people what's happening with the amount of voltage that the stack is producing. I think our inherent ambiguity is an honest representation of data and all of its shortcomings and misinterpretations. Data is malleable in form, it's rich in ideas and information, it can be deeply rewarding to work with, and it's a wonderful, powerful material, but it is not an end point. And I'd like to see us reduce the notion of data as power and finality, and instead see it as just one of many factors to consider, simply one perspective, or even just a numerically based opinion. Thanks.
Thanks a million, Julie. So our next talk is from Patrick Bresnahan.
Hi, my name is Patrick Bresnahan. I'm a lecturer in the Geography Department in Maynooth. But first of all, thanks for having me this evening to talk on the panel. I'm going to mostly talk about a specific project I was involved in, a participatory photography project that hopefully talks to these themes of citizen science and art and environment and expertise. But before I get into talking about that project, I'd just like to provide a bit of context and to say something about these two concepts in the title of the talk, slow violence and apprehension. So slow violence is a concept that some of you are probably have come across. It was coined, I guess, or used, developed by Rob Nixon in his wonderful book, Slow Violence and the Environmentalism of the Poor. And what he was trying to draw attention to in that book is the ways in which violence can be enacted, over a long period of time, and also across, sort of vast distances. And because of this kind of attritional or incremental forms of violence that sort of happen slowly and out of sight, they don't get registered. They don't become the kind of the basis of action of the seeking of reparations or of justice, because they're not visible, they're not perceptible. And we might think of examples here of things like, toxic chemicals, the buildup of toxic chemicals in environments and in bodies. You might think about the aftermath of something like Chernobyl or Bhopal, where the particular incident was spectacular and well reported, but the sort of aftermath, the residues of both of those incidents or accidents continues to be carried in the bodies of the people who are exposed. And that has different types of effects and is harder to sort of capture. And so something that's important, I think, that I want to just emphasize here about the term slow violence is that violence is something that is perpetrated. There's a perpetrator. It's not innocent. And by calling something slow violence, it's about pushing back against something being naturalized or being seen as inevitable. And it's about being able to assign responsibility to something or someone. And that's why it's so important to sort of make it perceptible. And in the book, Nixon talks about various writers and activists and movements where this is exactly what's happened. Forms of slow violence have been made perceptible and have become the basis of some kind of mobilization and action. And a word that he uses in reference to that is this word apprehension. And it's not a word I've thought a lot about, but I thought it might be interesting to sort of bring it to the panel, bring it to the discussion. He talks about apprehension as being something more than just, perception, more than just seeing something, being able to see something. It's the ways in which, in this case, some kind of slow violence is perceived, but also emoted, the kinds of feelings it evokes, and also the kinds of action it mobilizes. and so that's where the question of, I think, of aesthetics, the question of art, but also science, he writes here, as scientific and imaginative testimony becomes so important. The particular forms through which slow violence is made apprehensible, I guess. Okay, so thinking about that slow violence apprehension, in the context of my work, so thinking about rural Ireland here, that's in the title of the talk, not a place, that is generally thought about in the context of violence or even slow violence, but I think that there's something in that, the ways in which, particularly I'm thinking about landscapes, rural landscapes, the ways in which they tend to be represented in Ireland as somewhat benign, green fields, unchanging maybe. But really these are landscapes that, are industrial landscapes or even post-industrial landscapes, because they bear the kind of the remnants, the scars and the damage of industrial forms of agriculture. And those landscapes, a lot of that is to do with the chemical intensity of particular types of agriculture. So mainly the growing of grass for cows, for beef and dairy, mainly for dairy production. And this is really since the 1980s, with investments and with changes in European and Irish agricultural policy, and the ways in which the production of grass, the use of land in Ireland has become tied into sort of global agri-food industry. But that's not readily perceptible, and the kinds of damage that causes. I mean, it does register. I mean, it's well rehearsed now that the Irish agricultural sector is the biggest contributor to Ireland's emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. It's well registered that agriculture is the main driver of deteriorating water quality, so freshwater, rivers and lakes, which is where the focus of my work has been. And also in terms of biodiversity, knock-on effects in terms of declining biodiversity. So these are effects that are kind of registered at some level, but still, the kinds of the forces that have shaped, I guess, rural landscapes and communities and economies are not that visible, and it's harder to draw that out. So this is where this project comes in. It was a project that I was involved in with two other researchers, Ariel Hess and James White. And it was about looking at group water schemes, which are community owned and managed water systems around rural Ireland. We focused on three particular sites, one in Roscommon, one in Monaghan, and one in Mayo. In these sites, there was group water schemes and other people involved in protecting bodies of water. These bodies of water were a lake in one case, groundwater in another, and then a kind of a river and lake in the third case. And these water bodies were being protected for health reasons, because it was the source of drinking water, but also for environmental reasons, because these bodies of water had been deteriorating, and that deterioration had largely been linked to agriculture. And when we started looking into this and trying to sort of tell these stories maybe in a different way, it became clear that there was a lot of data about water quality in these particular sites. There was also data about land use change. And also there's data available about agricultural policy, of changes in agricultural economies. Data is available. But the way the data is collected, particularly data that's collected by the state and used by the state, often for reporting purposes to the EU, that data is often collected in ways and organized in ways that does not allow you to tell the kinds of stories that we wanted to tell. And so it was kind of partly out of frustration with the data that was there and the kinds of stories that you could tell with it, and partly out of our visits and our growing sort of acquaintances and knowledge of people who lived in these three case studies sites, that we realized quite quickly that the people who lived there, particularly people who were actively involved in trying to protect these bodies of water, didn't just know a lot about that body of water, didn't just know a lot about how changes had taken place, that their ability to observe changes, to document changes over time through their own experience, But they also knew a lot about the wider context, about changing agricultural economies, changing land use practices, and so on. And so we wanted to find a way of trying to capture this and represent it. And so we got some funding from the Irish Research Council to carry out this participatory photography project, which is called Qualities of Water. What that involves is we gave disposable cameras to maybe groups of between 10 and 15 people in each place, a variety of different people from different backgrounds, and asked them to take pictures of, in response to the prompt, what affects the quality of water where you live and work. And it was deliberately open prompt, and they went and took the pictures and then brought them back, and then we developed them, and then had sort of lengthy interviews or discussions about the images and what they meant. And this is a fairly established, well, it is an established method in the social sciences or visual methods called autophotography or photo voice or photo elicitation, different names. And the results of it were really, amazing. So some of the photos that were taken were not to do with agriculture. I mean, they were to do with different things. So this is a picture of a holy well, and, talking about how, previous cultures had a different relationship to water. It had a sort of a spiritual value. Other photos that were about, everyday sort of household products, and the ways in which these chemicals kind of leached out into the water system. But for the most part, the pictures were of things to do with agriculture and farming and the use of land. And this is what I wanted to talk about most. And so these pictures, this is a picture of some cows in a field. A beef farmer took these. And in the book that we produced, these images were just juxtaposed with some quotes from the interviews. Sometimes the quotes were directly linked to the photo, but often they weren't. And these photos are the photos that people took, and the way they talked about them. What they surfaced was an ability to sort of move between different scales, going back to this point of slow violence as being dispersed across space and time, an ability to connect things from the microscopic. So pictures of algae, pictures of what seems like a fairly banal piece of infrastructure, in this case a cowshed, with changes in European agricultural policy, changes in the breed of cattle, the ways in which these kinds of localized changes in the landscape and in the built environment were connected to decisions and economic sort of pressures and forces that took place far away. Here's a picture of a slurry tanker. Slurry featured very largely in the pictures. Here's somebody talking about, again, this woman. She wasn't a farmer, but she was the daughter of a farmer. But being able to talk about the kinds of, the specific details of what goes on in these agricultural sort of practices, which are rarely or not often represented or talked about. Here's a picture of a river that I guess is a direct impact of slurry and the runoff of nitrates and phosphates. So the growth of reeds and grass and algae, which ultimately can suffocate watercourses like this. In a picture like that, it looks quite nice. But this was the trigger for somebody to talk about the ways in which farmers are trained, the kind of education they undergo, the cultures that they live in, the kinds of ways in which that fosters a certain relationship to the land around productivity, which is not just an economic regime, but a kind of a cultural and social regime. And then this picture, which is probably one of my favorite, which is factor has gone over, and it was taken by a part-time beef farmer who took it of his own land. And I mean, he deliberately did that, he said, to implicate himself, because this was evidence of bad slurry practice, that this could run off into a watercourse, and he knew that that would have a negative impact. But this sort of triggered him to talk, for about 15 minutes about how, farmers are kind of caught within this very complex set of relationships, which include, in his case, having to contract out, buy-in services to do the slurry spreading, the ways in which the people who do the slurry spreading, it tend to be young kids home on the summer vacations, holidays, paid by the hour. And the way in which this is also combined with things like the soil and how the soil has been impacted and how this might subsequently be connected to climate change and more intense rainfall. And again, it's the way in which these connections were being made between, different scales, different things, different sort of technologies, different social relationships, and ultimately the kinds of political and economic and social systems and institutions that farmers are caught in. Which is sort of hard to pinpoint, but ultimately shifts the blame, responsibility away from individual farmers and places it on this wider context, which I guess is a kind of the goal of political ecology, trying to sort of surface these kind of wider political ecological relationships. So I just wanted to finish there, with this quote again, and the ways in which, maybe going back to the theme of the panel around citizen science and art, is that, what this project showed us, and I think what these pictures, the book that we have, the exhibition that we did show, is that, individuals who experience, who are most proximate to these kinds of environmental, changes, what we could describe as forms of slow violence, who are able to witness it, are not just citizen scientists in the case of being able to sort of collect data, to monitor changes in water quality. What they do have, and what this demonstrates, is that they have a much more sophisticated way of narrating and understanding and potentially apprehending, the wider contexts and the wider drivers of these forms of slow violence and these kind of forms of environmental damage, that should be foregrounded much more in the kinds of accounts that we have of these kinds of environmental problems. So I'll just leave it there and finally say thank you to the EPA and Irish Research Council who funded the project.
Okay, I'm just going to jump straight ahead and play Fiona's video for you now. Just 1 second.
Hi everybody, I'd like to thank Rachel for inviting me to contribute to this panel discussion today. My background is in chemistry, fine art and multimedia systems, and I work primarily with sculpture, sound, print, hardware and code to create data-driven, process-based works. These works explore the idea of making scientific data systems more visible. My recent projects have focused on 2 main strands of inquiry, one in the area of space science and astrophysics, and the other explores climate change, environmental sensors, and bioindicators, plants or animals which act as sensors. During a recent residency at Parody Studios in University College, Dublin, I collaborated with researchers from the Space Science Group to develop a data-driven kinetic sculpture which responds to real-time satellite data. Using custom-designed hardware and software, the sculptured GRB locator array tracks the position of recently detected gamma-ray bursts. Gamma-ray bursts are the result of the cataclysmic death of stars and occur billions of light years away, the instant before a star dies. Everything we are emanates from this moment in time. The entire periodic table was processed inside the body of a star. That star unraveled or exploded, and here we are. So today I'm going to talk about another recent work, Sensing Ecologies, which I developed during a recent residency called An Urgent Inquiry. The Urgent Inquiry Commission gave 3 artists the opportunity to explore the biodiversity and effects of climate change in 3 areas along the east coast of Ireland, Wexford, Fingal and Dublin City. The residencies were supported by the Arts Council Invitation to Collaborate scheme and by each local authority. My research took place on Opal Island. It is internationally recognised for its habitats and wildlife. Opal Island is noted for many things. One of the interesting things about Opal Island is that it hasn't always existed and formed in the 19th century and because of human actions rather than geological ones. The work I developed for this commission was the app Sensing Ecologies, an audio augmented reality soundscape of geolocated interviews which explore environmental sensing, referencing both man-made sensors as well as bioindicators, which are the plants and animals which act as natural sensors. Each geolocated interview is confined within shapes on the app map. These zones will trigger content when the listeners physically walk inside using GPS. Working with audio AR gave me a new tool to unfold some of the stories around the tools and methods which researchers from various fields use to observe biodiversity and habitats. The geolocative experience also allowed me to address a wider audience and create an artwork in a public space by respecting the delicate and important conservation areas of the island. I will now play a selection of samples from the geolocated interviews.
And those 2 walls together, the idea was that they would create a channel which would deal with the question of the silt, would push it out, push it to one side, which would create this, one channel in and out of the harbour, make that good for trade. The effect then was that the sediment that was building up, that was coming off the Liffey, instead of that creating sandbanks that were a problem for trade, that started to accumulate on the north side of the North Wall. And that is what over time has now formed Opal Island.
Opal Island is one of our best known sand dune systems in Ireland, and it's interesting because it represents a huge range of habitats, from the very exposed habitats by the sea into more stable habitats in the middle of the island. Each of those habitats, you can think of them as a representation of time as well, because the habitats that are closest to the sea are the most recent habitats and they're very young. But once you get up to the marram dunes, 2 things happen. First of all, marram can grow very quickly in very difficult conditions, and it thrives on being buried. So every time the marram is buried by new sand, it grows faster and it grows up through the sand, and that's what allows it to develop really, really high dunes. But there's still not very many plants in there. There are still very few plants who can tolerate that type of exposure. But because the dunes get very high, the back of the dunes is very sheltered. So the next sort of sequence in our time series is fixed dunes, and in behind the marram, in the shelter of the marram, where most of the water there comes from rainwater, so it's fresh water, you have fixed dunes, and these really look like very flower-rich grasslands. And because there's vegetation there, that vegetation fixes the sand, so the sand can't blow away anymore. And that's it's an example of what we call an ecosystem service. So it's a benefit that nature can provide to humans, and that is making new land. So basically sand dunes, what sand dunes are doing is they're making new land, and it buffers the action of nature, the really damaging actions of nature, away from human activities. Rainwater it's less dense than seawater. So what happens is, if you've got an island made of sand and the sand becomes very permeable, once the rain falls, it goes straight down into the sand, and then it reaches the seawater layer which is essentially groundwater, and it sits on top of it. So you end up with a lens of fresh water on top of the groundwater. Or else in some places, if there's a little valley in between the sand dunes, you might have an area where the ground is actually very close to the water table, and in winter, it's so shallow, the water that can come up above the level of the ground, and you have a little temporary lake. So in the wet areas, you have species which are able to tolerate being flooded in winter, but then being dried out in summer. And because there's a restricted set of species, we can look at it and decide whether we think it's in good condition or not, because these species should be able to tolerate very few nutrients and wet and dry conditions, depending on the time of the year. So if, for example, the water table gets farther away from the surface and the dunes are basically drying out, you'll find fewer and fewer species that are typical of wet conditions. And that's important because the level of the water in a sand dune is important for the stability of the dunes. And if the water table drops a lot, then the dunes are more likely to erode, because the dunes in winter, when it's very, very windy, they tend to erode down to the level of the water table. So this is another ecosystem service that if we allow dunes to dry out, we may lose. We have been able to put sensors back into the wells that have been there all along. So we'll have a nice set of data going all the way back to the start of this century. Hopefully that will help us to detect changes in the dunes and relate them to environmental pressures. By using those sensors, you can, for example, see whether there's lots and lots of rain, but the water level doesn't rise, and that might indicate that people are pumping that water off sand dunes. Or you can see whether, for example, over time, if we can compare the amount of rainfall now and the water level in sand dunes now to what it was like 10 years ago or what it was like 20 years ago, we can begin to understand whether there is a trend of increased rainfall or increased transpiration of the vegetation. So we can actually detect the effects of climate change potentially in the long run.
But actually, animals that make sound also compete in a dimension that we don't usually think about, and that's competition for space in what we call the soundscape. When animals are competing for acoustic space, it's the idea that the soundscape is a finite resource, and that animals can separate themselves within the soundscape in order to not drown each other out and not compete too strongly with each other. And we call it the acoustic niche hypothesis, because the idea of the niche in ecology is that species find their own part of an ecological landscape, if you like, and they can do the same in the acoustic landscape as well, in the soundscape. And so broadly, I'm interested in human impacts on ecosystems. And so sound is a part of this, and actually the data revolution, the big data revolution, means that now we have the potential to get more ecological data than we've ever had before. And we can use the huge advances in technology that have come about over the past few years to actually get high resolution ecological data that we just didn't have access to in the past. And so one way that we might use this technology to get ecological data is using biosensors. So one example of this would be acoustic monitoring. And we can use acoustic monitoring to understand how animals deal with human activity, as well as to just better understand their behavior and the timing of their life cycle events. And ultimately, we can get some sense of the size of their populations and the numbers of different species are living in different places. And so we can use this acoustic data for lots of different things, to ask lots of really big and interesting ecological questions that otherwise we would have to spend a long time physically going out into the field and looking for these animals and counting them in order to answer those questions. And over longer timescales, so lots of monitoring projects are already underway on kind of short timescales, and they've been going for, maybe a couple of years now. But over longer timescales, we can start to really ask these big questions, like how does urbanization or how does climate change impact ecosystems? And so there was a high-profile paper came out, a scientific paper came out earlier this year, saying for the first time that we have evidence that climate change is breaking Earth's beat in terms of the dynamics and the timing of these soundscapes. So I believe the study recorded in the same place at the same time of year for several years in a row, and they're finding that the soundscape is getting quieter. There are fewer natural species. There are fewer vocalizing species there than there were before. A definite effect of climate change on soundscapes. And so we are seeing changes in how soundscape dynamics occur through the year as climate change progresses.
What makes orchids really good plants to study as indicators of climate change is when you pair that study with the study of phenology. And this is where you observe and document cyclical changes of how plants and animals react. And what makes orchids particularly good for use in these types of studies is that they are at times species-specific pollinated. So only a single species of insect has the right dimensions to effectively pollinate the orchid species. So when we look again at the spider orchid, they rely on naive male wasps who have yet to learn exactly what the female of the species looks like. And they will try to copulate with the flower. And in doing so, they will pollinate it. It is very important that these things are studied in the sense of how quickly and how dramatically climate change appears to be having on our natural world.
But I think it's interesting to think about, again, what it is about this time or moment where something shifts, that there's a shift in the use of energy, so the use of coal and fossil fuel-based energy within the production, within the work of production, the same time as you have the building of expanding of ports and increasing in trade. These things are all bound up as a very important moment in the sort of, I'm not going to say the beginning, but the takeoff of sort of modern industrial capitalism. And the evidence of that, or the legacies of that, are on the one hand, climate change, CO2 built up in the atmosphere. And on the other, which is what's so interesting about Bull Island, the making of Bull Island, in a way, the accretion of silt that forms Bull Island it begins with the accretion of CO2 in the atmosphere, which is what has driven climate change.
So thanks, everybody. Maybe now that we're finished playing the videos, we can welcome our speakers back. So I don't know if people want to put their cameras back on. So I just wanted to thank the three of you for your really amazing and very complimentary talks. Like, you'd never know that you weren't all in the same room putting them together, because I think they really, there was some really kind of beautiful crossovers between those. So I wanted to, I suppose, take my privilege as sort of the chair and jump in with a first question for the three of you. And it's based on this idea actually that Patrick brought up when he spoke about this idea of apprehension as being this kind of knowledge that includes perception, emotion, and action. And it reminded me of, I was at a panel a couple of years ago, which was on art and politics, and the documentarian Laura Poitras was speaking. And I remember she said something that I never forgot. She was speaking about, you know, why art was still really important politically. And what she said was, you know, that we don't act because of what we know. We don't act because of, you know, because of facts or because of kind of raw data. It takes something more. And I remember her saying, you know, that for her, she felt that art could be a space for these sorts of evidentiary practices that allow for other registers of knowing and affect. And that maybe this idea chimes with that idea of apprehension that Patrick was speaking about in his citizen science project. Not just knowing, but feeling, emoting, understanding our own position within that. And I guess I had a question, maybe particularly for our two artists, whether, I don't know, do you agree with this idea that maybe art can be a space for this kind of knowing that's about, you know, more than just knowing something, or is that kind of a very lofty claim to be making about artistic practices?
Shall I go first, Fiona? I think it probably does. I think what art makes a really a good artwork makes a really successful thing of doing is placing a gap between the audience and the work for people to fill in the rest of the story, you know, so that whether it's a clear ambiguity or whether it's just a feeling because it's an essence of something or a hint at something, and then they can fill that gap in, and then it allows, you know, your audience then will project whatever they come to, you know, whatever they're feeling that day, whether they've just been bumped into in the doorway on the way into the gallery, or anything that's just happened to them right there, or something that's happened to them a long time ago in their lives. Whatever they're carrying, they bring to the artwork. So it's always a sort of like a two-way thing, and they'll perceive it differently. But I'm interested in the idea of apprehension because I always associate it with a kind of a sense of maybe foreboding, or, you know, sometimes it's excitement. It's not always, and it seemed to me that in Patrick, in your presentation, that it was more, it seemed to be as more of a negative than a positive, but you can be apprehensive about something really exciting. And then it just made me think about whether apprehension was this idea of getting hold of something and confronting whatever it is, like that the actual idea of apprehending someone, like a policeman would have someone running down the street or something like that. So it kind of sparked loads of different ideas, but all of that is kind of like extra contextual information above and beyond whatever the artwork or the is that you're looking at.
Maybe before we jump to Fiona, do you want to talk a little bit about this idea of apprehension? So I think you said it was both of those things, Patrick, right? It's like, it's that feeling of some kind of anxiety, but it's also maybe about you apprehend a concept. Or
yeah, I mean, like I said, it wasn't so much. I mean, maybe it goes back to the kind of the point about the ambiguity that Julie was mentioning, but it does have all of these different meanings, and, you know, particularly those two, which seem somehow to be contrary to one another, or contradictory. The idea of a feeling of anxiety or foreboding, but on the other hand, this sense of understanding. And I don't, like I said in the talk, is that I somehow feel like those two things can be, you know, mutual. You know, that there's almost a sense in which, like, understanding, like with the participants in that project, you know, there was a sense. I mean, it's not as if doing that project or talking about the kinds of causes of these slow forms of violence, environmental violence, there wasn't a sense in which that was kind of mobilizing a fervent, you know, action or activism or anything like that. There was partly, I guess, a kind of a hopelessness too, you know. It was partly a sense of this thing being enormous and too grand. But I almost feel like that there's something in that is a true, well, not a true, but like a closer understanding of what's happening. You know, if you compare that to I don't know if we'll go into that in other questions, but like there is an emphasis on within governance, environmental governance, on getting more data. The more data that you can get, the more you can manage problems. And there's a certain naivety to that. I would say that is sort of maybe demonstrated or short-circuited by the kinds of understanding or apprehension that people have who, you know, really see the kind of longer histories and build-up of these kinds of problems and how they're connected to these wider, the inertia of these kinds of institutions and economies. Yeah.
So Fiona, I don't know whether you can remember our question, but we were speaking a minute ago just about this idea of like ways of knowing that art might facilitate that are beyond just like purely kind of factual or, you know, or seemingly objective ways of knowing that are maybe a bit more affective. And I wondered, had you thoughts on that then?
Yeah, I guess, yeah, in a way I felt that artworks, well, to engage with complexities of the rapidly changing worlds or ideas of Anthropocene, it demands a sense of deceleration. And so an artwork can let us slow down to the pace of a gallery or a museum visit, or yeah, so so it allows us to slow down and to have a different viewpoint.
I think that's a really key point as well, that maybe there's like and you know, somebody I mentioned earlier in a comment, I think as well, something they really liked about Julie's work as well was this sort of use of time, or like different registers of time at play in the work. But I think what you're pointing out is really interesting as well, like this idea that that maybe art can create some kind of a pause then, or a space for engaging with things. So there's a couple of questions coming in here on the comments, but I actually just had one more question that I kind of wanted to put to you guys before sort of opening it up a little bit more, and also giving you guys the chance to ask questions of each other if you wanted. And this is just something that really came across to me in all of your talks, was how much you challenged, I suppose, this idea of data, I guess, as being in any way kind of objective or kind of factual as a practice. And it's something I've always noticed, particularly with artistic practices that deal with data, but also maybe with citizen science, that there's no sense, the work always kind of acknowledges that contingency. It acknowledges the sort of broader politics of like whatever kind of politics of knowledge making is going on. It generally acknowledges, and this came across very much in Julie's talk in particular, it acknowledges the artist's own position within that system in terms of making particular decisions. And I guess I wanted to ask you guys though about how that sort of practice then is perceived. How are like these art or citizen science projects perceived though when they're go out into the world, when they're shown in a gallery or they're shown in a community centre? Because sometimes I feel like when you frame a project, for example, as I'm going to say this in inverted commas, as just art, for example, or just citizen science, sometimes that can be really powerful because it can kind of give you a space to be more critical than you could be, for example, in like a policy document or something. Because people, sometimes things that are seen as being just art or just community science, they kind of go below the radar a bit. But I guess on the other side of that, there's a tendency sometimes to see these projects as being kind of not producing the same kind of legitimacy, or the knowledge isn't always seen as being as rigorous because of this kind of just art idea. And I wanted to know then, how did you find that these projects were perceived? How were they counted? How were they labeled, I guess? Sorry, lots of questions there. Anyone want to jump in?
Well, I can. I mean, I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, and I think from that idea of rigor and rigor only belonging to scientists is a fallacy that a lot of the artists I know, particularly artists that work with science, that collaborate with scientists, or that are scientists within their practice, are almost more rigorous sometimes, because they're asking all the questions that other people hadn't thought about. And I remember working with a team of nanotechnologists, and they were all talking about the the nanoscale, and when a particle gets to this point, and I couldn't quite understand that this sort of and I was like, what is the nanoscale? Where does it kick in the scheme of things? And it was just an arbitrary measurement. And when we looked into it, the measurement it was just prolific in scientific literature, but no one had actually there was no, it was just there because someone had written it and then someone else had cited them and so on. And actually we wrote a paper that said the nanoscale should be when a property changes from one form to another. So when aluminium is small enough to be explosive, and that should be when it goes into the nanoscale. And so those and I remember working with the PhD students and the professors there, and they were like, God, we didn't even question that, because it's just a trope that we work with all the time. And that's my example, but there's other people that I've spoken to have said, we're prodding places and really thinking deeply about things that might be not considered. I mean, not all scientists, not all artists, but there is I think because artists are often seen as, we don't have a barrier between us and the audience. Like a scientist has to follow kind of certain guidelines and the scientific method and so on, whereas an artist is straight there, raw in front of people. So if I'm doing something with a piece of data that is a particularly valid piece of data that shouldn't be messed around with for whatever reason, I have a responsibility not to hoodwink the audience or not to misrepresent it if I feel that is important. So we have to strike a balance between, what is okay to play with. Are we, if we're messing around with something, it has to be clear because we don't want to falsify something. I mean, I think it's interesting that the rigor is deeper and wider in an artwork, can be.
I totally agree. I love that what you just said, though, prodding places. I think is a really good quote. Patrick and Fiona, do you have any thoughts on this? I feel like you both probably do.
Do you want to go ahead, Fiona? Or do you want to?
Yeah. Well, I guess, often in this project, Sensing Ecologies, a lot of the scientists would remark that also that a lot of the time the data needs to be validated. So the human observer in many cases is still very important for data science. And
can I ask you a really nosy question before we jump on to P? Because you have a background in chemistry, I guess, why did you end up going from that into multimedia systems and art then? Sorry, that's totally off the cuff.
I guess I was always interested in art, but as it turned out that when I studied multimedia systems, a few years after beginning my art career, and I kind of felt a lot more comfortable working with data and programming, and so it's kind of been a turnaround.
I just think it's interesting. You're so kind of you're very, you're one of these people who's very comfortable, I guess, in both of those places. But Patrick, sorry, I totally derailed that now off in a different direction. Patrick, I think maybe this question of like labeling or how things get counted as well is really important in the like citizen science project that you were speaking about. Yeah,
I would just say in terms of references, there's a really great article called Being a Scientist Means Taking Sides. It's from 1993. Mary O'Brien, she was a biologist, and it was a reference that I had heard from another artist, but scientist actually, but has a background in artist called Max Lieboyron, who runs a lab in Newfoundland, which is described, she calls it, well, they call, it's a decolonial feminist lab. And they do amazing work around marine microplastics. But if any of you, that website, it's so great in terms of getting to a lot of these points about the questions of kind of impartiality and objectivity in science, and obviously a lot inspired by feminist science studies. But that question of impartiality, I mean, in the context I was talking about and working in, I mean, you know, particularly in an area that's so contested, so farming and responsibility and agricultural policy, the government, because it's so contested, science becomes actually really politicized in the way in which it can remain neutral. And you know, if you have other kind of, you know, perspectives or, you know, accounts which you know, don't talk in such sort of consensual terms, well then it's going to be quick to dismiss that as biased, as being, you know, controversial or political in a certain way. And I think that that's, you know, historically in these kinds of cases, going back to Rachel Carson, Silent Spring, you know, DDT, and all the way through in any of these cases where there are a lot of interests, you know, you really see that question of that's not impartial, you know. So yeah, I mean, it's not something that can easily be resolved or answered, but I guess, you know, being able to show or demonstrate, and in our project, we didn't call it a citizen science project, but I think being able to document and demonstrate, you know, exactly like Julie said, this question of rigor and the ways in which, you know, data can be collected and evidence compiled and analyzed in ways that are systematic and rigorous, but using different kinds of methods, you know, to come to different kinds of, you know, outcomes, I think is really important.
We have an interesting contribution here as well in the chat, which I might just read out before we jump into one or two of the questions here. So Barry O'Sullivan is sort of responding to some of the comments here about, you know, data impartiality, and said, Julie is touching on some very interesting concepts in science related to phase transitions. The interesting things happen at the interfaces to change. Some people refer to these as tipping points. Fiona's comment is also very interesting, related to rigor. Often in science, rigor is only possible after an abstraction or simplification process. The result is that the insight becomes restricted. But the interesting thing about the artistic perspective is that it reveals the complexity. There are lots of ways we could explore these different perspectives. And I can see people, you guys have even been saying kind of, yes, and sorry, one more comment here. Science would benefit from the artistic process, the revelation of complexity and perspective, which I think is maybe, you know, sort of what we were discussing there. I wanted to actually pull in a question here from Glenn Loughran, which is something I was dying to know a bit more about, Julie, when we were looking at your project with the mole rats. So Glenn is asking, he said he's very interested in Julie's argument for data privacy for non-human actors. To what extent does environmental sensing extend the sphere of surveillance, and can this be offset in our projects?
Yeah, I was, you know, when I started reading about the impact of academic, particularly academic biosensing in different environments, and how it was being the system being totally hacked really by collectors and poachers, and to the extent that I read one paper by some, I think, Chinese researchers. I read a translation, and they had found a really unique piece of flora. And normally when you're writing a scientific paper, you would write, I found it in this location, and this is my evidence of proof of finding this new thing, and we've given it a new name. But they concealed the location to quite a big area, actually, so that people wouldn't go and collect it. So what's happening is that that was human observation, but when there's digital sensors out in the environment, the whole point of them is to locate and monitor what is there and what is happening. So kind of like this, particularly the cameras and stuff, but it's inherently like a massive surveillance system to nature, and it is problematic. I mean, the on safari now, I think when you go to parts of Africa to go on safari, they have signs up that say, please disable your metadata, you know, make sure that if you're posting to social media that stuff is all switched off. It's a huge problem, and I think that data privacy is a problem for humans, let alone for the rest of the world. So yeah, I think just raising awareness of it is one of the things that we can do.
I just seeing some comments here as well in relation to people who've actually used Fiona's Sensing Ecology app and really, really enjoyed it. And somebody earlier on, Joanna Hopkins as well, was asking Fiona if she was continuing to work with environmental researchers, or was this just a once-off for the Sensing Ecologies project?
Actually, yeah, I will continue to work with some of the researchers that I met. So yeah, there was a broad range of researchers, and yeah, one in particular, Shane Regan, works on, he's a hydrologist, and so yeah, he worked with me to collect the data from the alder marsh. And yes, we've also visited some bogs in Roscommon, and yeah, they've set up different sensors there, CO2 chambers and environmental sensors. So yeah, we hope to work with that data in the future. And yeah, and also some tracking of brent geese is another project that I might work with.
Thank you. So Patrick, we have another question for you here, which comes back to this idea of slow violence that you spoke about in your talk. So Barry O'Sullivan is asking, in relation to Patrick's comments on slow violence on nature, I wonder if we could also see this as a critique on science. Scientists are often driven by short-term goals and metrics, and the consequence of, sorry, the chat's moving all over the place, the consequence is that premature ideas are sold to the world. I don't know if you had a comment or kind of response to this, Patrick.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think what I'd say is that I think it's been said already. It's not artists and scientists. There's different types of artistic practice, different types of scientific practice, and these happen under different conditions too. And I think that one thing that really struck us in our project, because we talked a lot to catchment scientists and people who are doing work around water quality and stuff like that, pollution, is that they were working on short-term contracts. And I think that that's a really interesting thing, the kind of precarious working conditions of scientists, often in these state agencies. And the ways in which citizen science actually is often seen as a way of plugging those holes, because if you have a strategy of environmental governance, which is about collecting more data, the emphasis is on more data equals better management, that's very labor intensive. So, you've got scientists on the ground, but there's not so many, they're in precarious contracts, that affects the kind of work. There was all sorts of ways this stuff became very apparent to us. But then on the other hand, you have moves towards IoT and sensors, which is the idea of automating this type of work, which, has already been kind of touched on. But I think that's kind of interesting, is the way in which there's a move towards kind of real-time data, and the idea that you can kind of automate environments, manage them through this kind of circular logic. And that's where it's heading to. And I think the point about slow violence is interesting, because it absolutely comes up against the kinds of knowledge that these participants who are in these places for sort of 30-40 years and could not only observe and talk about the changes they'd seen in terms of water quality or whatever, but also in terms of the wider kind of economies and kind of that kind of context, which is the kind of analysis that you can't get with I guess automating it.
Sorry, just leaving a little pause there in case either of you wanted to jump in on that sort of time-based question. I guess a question that was running through my head a little bit when I was watching your talks earlier was this sort of question of transdisciplinarity, which is something that is being explored across all of the talks that we're doing in the digital culture series, and it's something that we're seeing a lot in your practices. And I guess I'm just kind of curious, in a not very intellectual at all sort of way, about what your experience of that was. So as Fiona knows, because we kind of worked together a little bit, Trinity, in the past, I did my PhD in an engineering department, and part of that was, and I have a background in fine art, I should say, and part of that then was kind of interfacing, with these different disciplines and kind of acquiring sort of the language of that discipline, you know, in order to sort of liaise with that, with you know, people like with engineers, for example, in a project or in an area of research. And, you know, sometimes you found there was this really kind of rich sort of dialogues happening in those sorts of spaces. Sometimes the communication just completely like broke down. And something that really struck me, you know, in watching works, and particularly maybe your work, Fiona, is how you're obviously you're very sort of adept at working across these disciplines. I don't know if there's really a question there, but I guess I'm curious about your sort of experience of, yeah, working at the intersection of these disciplines. Do you have sort of difficulty sort of you know, with that kind of like disciplinary specific language, I guess, when you're working with people from all of these different sorts of domains? I mean, you had people on your podcast from, you know, so many different, on your app from like so many different disciplines.
Yeah, I guess, I just think it's really interesting to build up a network of, you know, of researchers in a specific area. And yeah, I guess, yeah, I am quite comfortable, maybe because of my background, and yeah, so also, yeah, because I work with technology, I guess when I worked with the space science group, that was a language then that we both had when we started those collaborations together. And yeah, I think, yeah, it's kind of really interesting because, yeah, I've built up kind of a network of both and people from environmental research, and then also working with technology as well. And on my new residency at Talent Garden in DCU, I'll work with different companies that use new technologies. So it might be a really interesting point where we can have crossovers between both areas.
I think I think I was kind of blabbing a bit there, but I guess what you're saying is, yeah, it's kind of reminding me that, like, hearing you speak about that, of the kind of different connections that you've made, it just strikes me that, you know, you're quite unusual people maybe in some ways, in that you have this sort of competency across these different areas. And I guess something I just wonder sometimes is, like, it seems like it's a lot of pressure, or it's a big ask sometimes for people then to work in these spaces, because you're kind of asking somebody to kind of be a jack of all trades and to be able to speak, you know, in these different languages and acquire these different kinds of jargons, but sort of move in a very, you know, kind of fluid way between them. I don't know, is that something you've experienced, Julie, as kind of maybe a challenge of your work?
I think I don't know. I feel like I am very cross-disciplinary because I'm just because I'm curious about everything. So over time, you just accumulate lots of different skills and knowledge and stuff. But I also find that a lot of my collaborators are the same. You know, I think I worked with a scientist who was a phenomenal sort of natural history. He had really good drawing skills and used to do all that as well, but it just wasn't. And so he could draw better than me. So in some ways, it's nice to blur the boundaries and to try and get away from this, you are a scientist, you're an engineer, you're a whatever, because most people have elements of all of it, if they're kind of quite established in their field, because it's very rare that you can just sit in a very boundaried place now and just do one small thing. I know maybe abstract mathematics or something, you're just in one tiny bubble. Or it could be that just I naturally attract people like that, because I find they're interested in what I'm doing, so they're drawn to me and vice versa.
So I just wanted to leave we've one last question, which I think is sort of for everybody, but I guess I wanted just to make sure that you guys didn't have any specific questions or comments for each other that we haven't sort of had space to address, I guess, in the kind of quite short discussion that we've had so far.
I think I did have one comment that occurred to me when you were mentioning earlier about the idea of time and I think all three of us, the thread there is this, is a sense of, there's one thing about nature, and that it is always changing. It is always slightly inching forwards. There's always something going on. It's never static. And I think with the kind of work we do and when Patrick was talking about the idea of slow violence and apprehension, Fiona, your work, it's all about these kind of really small steps, shifts that's moving. And I think that I love that. I really love that. And I like it. I like my work to be like that. I like the slow contemplative stuff because I feel like it reflects nature more than art that is just one instance, or is a spectacle, or is a kind of here and now kind of thing. So I like that, although our practices are different, that there is that commonality. And I think the slow violence thing is so relevant to climate change. And my concern is that like death by 1,000 cuts, it's that kind of thing, isn't it? Creeping forward, and before you know it, it's a little bit too late. So that's not very cheery note at the end. I think that there's something in there that is really positive, this kind of constant moving that is quite beautiful.
I agree. So we have one last question here, which maybe is kind of difficult to answer in a way, because none of us probably have have control of the coffers, but do you think there could be more support for collaboration between artists, politics, or policymakers maybe, and scientists in Ireland and the UK? And maybe, what might that look like, that support? Any thoughts on that? This is from Anne Kelly.
You're like, wait, there should always be more support for art.
Yeah, there definitely should.
It's tough. It's tough.
Sorry, you go ahead, Julie.
No, I've just been talking. Go on, sorry.
Okay, I was just going to say a quick about. Obviously, definitely, there should be more supports, but I wonder to what extent there is an idea of what those projects look like. Like all funding calls, and I do think that there is, again, going to this point about like something that's consensual, a nice project between artists and science, that's transdisciplinary. It shows that we're thinking about these things and so on. But, if there's a project which doesn't neatly fit within the kinds of ideas of what that looks like, and might be a bit more dissensual, that might be a bit more, dissenting in the way in which it, I don't know, does the project, maybe it needs more time. That's the other thing. A lot of what we've talked about is time. To develop these kinds of relationships, to develop some kind of like really, interesting, meaningful, clever, it takes time. Funding doesn't generally work on that. So I think there should be more supports, but also possibly the ways in which that money is distributed and you can access to it maybe needs to change as well,
Such a key point. I think the kinds of outcomes as well, the kinds of expected sort of outcomes or deliverables, sometimes the way, as you say, the ways that those are framed and then sort of framed or put towards artists can be quite limiting, Yeah, that's, I think, a really, really interesting point actually to end on. So I'm just looking at the time, it's just coming up to past. So I think we're going to leave it there. I just wanted to say a huge thank you to our three speakers tonight, Fiona McDonald, Patrick Bresnahan and Julie Freeman. And also big thank you to Anne Kelly in the gallery there, who's doing all the kind of tech work in the background, coordinating between the YouTube live stream and our Zoom discussion. So just really, really kind of big thank you to everybody. And thanks to our audience as well for their great questions.
Thanks.
Great. Thanks a million.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.